This is Dennis Ramundi. I'm here with my co-host, Phil Goldberg, author of American Veda. Our podcast, Spirit Matters, found at spiritmatterstalk.com. Our guest today, Ms. Claire Hoffman. She is a journalist. She was formerly a staff reporter for the Los Angeles Times and a freelance reporter for the New York Times. She serves on the board of her family foundation, the Goldhurst Foundation, as well as the Columbia School of Journalism. She has a master's degree in journalism and also from Columbia University, and also a master's degree in religion from the University of Chicago. Her book, Greetings from Utopia Park, Surviving a Transcendent Childhood. Great book. I read it, had a very difficult time putting it down. I read it in about three sittings, which is quick for me. And it's especially interesting to me because I lived for 2 years in Utopia Park, so I could really relate to much of what was written about. Claire, thank you so very much for taking the time to come on our show today.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk to both of you.
And we're excited to talk to you. And before we begin, in the interest of full disclosure, we should mention that your book is in large part about your years in Fairfield, Iowa, in the center of the Transcendental Meditation world. And both Dennis and I spent years there ourselves before you. Maybe even before you were born, come to think of it. Bars of
Oh, yeah.
So just in the interest of full disclosure for our listeners, Claire, let's begin. You had a successful journalism career and were in academia, and then decided to write this memoir. Tell us, for our listeners, what gave rise to the desire to write this book? What was the impetus?
Well, I think it had been percolating for a long time. So while it seems like something that just happened, it's something that has been very slowly happening for a long time in some ways. I think initially I had seen it as an investigative project. Maybe a decade ago I was very interested in using my skills as a reporter and an investigative reporter on the movement and Maharishi, and sort of getting clarity where there isn't a lot of it with the TM organization. And then I put it down. I sort of, life happened. And after I became a mother, I found myself sort of strangely drawn back to TM, wanting to meditate more, wanting to sort of reconnect in some way with that part of my life and have that be something that I passed on to my children, which was surprising because I think, a decade ago I was probably pretty cynical about the movement. So, I think my position evolved, and I felt like that evolution was interesting. I mean, I guess as a writer you always have to think your ideas are interesting, but there was a lot for me to kind of work through and think about in writing this book in terms of belief and the religious experience and the way that groups work and how, individuals can participate in these sort of cosmic groups or, these groups around ideas of the divine and, the good things and the bad things within that, and, also how we create meaning in our own lives. So, I mean, for me, the last couple of years that I've spent working on it have been super rewarding because it's allowed me to think through a lot of big questions, not necessarily answer them, but think through them.
Right. Claire, I wanted to mention to you that I've talked to a number of people that have read your book. One thing they've all had in common is everybody has read it like they couldn't put it down. So, and I've heard mostly people just love the book, but the criticisms from the book come from one of two groups. Either people that are very deeply involved with TM and the TM organization and the intentional community that they created, and people that are very against that, TM and the community, and like the two opposite ends, the people that are very much still propagating TM, the people that are very against it. One group saying it wasn't complimenting enough of the movement. The other group said it was too complimentary. And I thought, actually, my response was, hey, that's a great, that's to Claire's credit, because obviously she, to me, when I hear that, it seems that you looked at it very objectively, not trying to propagate anything, not trying to condemn anything, but really sort of just looking at it in as fair and balanced a way as you could. Was that your approach and angle on it, or did you have a specific agenda?
Yeah, I mean, I think to Phil's question about why write the book, part of that was that I did feel like those were the two conversations about the movement and, really about religion and organized religion in general. It's either people who are members, who have a vested interest, who've dedicated themselves entirely to a religious movement, or it's people who are saying it's a complete scam. These are con artists. We are idiots. People are stealing money. It's a sham. And I felt like it's just, my experience was so much more complicated than that, and I wanted to write about that. And I feel like the truth is, for most people, it's more complicated than that. And I totally get both positions, but I will say, I completely get the anti-TM movement position, for example, because I think there's a lot of kids that I grew up with specifically that fall into that category, and not a lot, but a fair number. And I have heard from them about that they don't feel like I, dropped the hammer hard enough or indicted the TM movement for, the wrongs of the past. And I get that. I do. I that's a interesting conversation to have, but I just don't see it that way. I do see it as a more complicated experience. And so I feel like so much about belief and spirituality and religious movements is about experience, so that seemed like the best way to write about it, was to sort of do it through the personal as opposed to this sort of objective investigation, because I actually don't think it would work.
Well, I want to welcome you to the club, Claire.
Thank you.
Because after American Veda came out, I got it from both sides.
Yeah.
And not just the TM world and the followers of... we should let people know who don't that we're talking about transcendental meditation and the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi's teachings that became the centerpiece of Fairfield, Iowa. But I covered in my book all the groups that came and all the guru-centric groups, and I got it the same thing. It was like you were too kind on those reprobates, or you didn't say enough good things about my guru and his wonderful contributions. So I take that as evidence of fairness and balance, and I hope you do as well. Did you look at any of the other organizations in the process of your work, or any of the other teachings that came through to find parallels between your experience and others?
Well, I do want to say that I used your book while writing mine, and I love it. I love your book, and it's such a great resource. I hope that everybody who is interested in meditation and sort of Eastern philosophy picks it up, because it's so important, and it's just it's sort of a fundamental, I think. In terms of other organizations and parallels, I mean, I'm always fascinated by new religious movements, and as a reporter, I've reported on Scientology, and I've reported on the FLDS, the Fundamentalist Mormons. And I always love reading about Children of God and the Rajneeshis, but those are all, sort of more extreme in some ways than the TM movement. The TM movement was sort of wonderfully disorganized and messy and loose in a lot of ways, and you could belong or you could not belong. So I don't see parallels in that. I mean, I do think one of the things that I wish I had more grounding in is sort of understanding the way that the TM movement and its philosophy and Maharishi's philosophy sort of fits into the larger history of transcendentalism in America, because it does, and I think if I had been writing for a narrower audience, I would have maybe had more of that in the book, because I think that's such an interesting piece.
No, Claire, for those who haven't read the book, and again, I highly recommend if you do, it's more than a book just about the community of Fairfield and where you grew up in the particular spiritual organization that you associated with, but it's a book about faith and about belief and meaning and how one deals with crisis when one has a crisis in faith or whatever. So you came to Fairfield when you were young, like 4 or 5 years old, with your mother, and in the book it sounds like initially the experience was very good, but then as you grow up, and this happens to people of all faiths, you reach a point where there's some questioning, some doubt. Tell us about that period and how you transitioned out of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the sort of cynicism that I'm talking about. I think when we're actually pretty young, around 12 or 13, I just started seeing the world really differently. Up until that moment, for me, I had been, like a real true believer. I really felt like I was within the bubble of reality that Maharishi and his movement had created, and I really saw the world through Maharishi-colored glasses, and that felt fantastic and very real. And I think, when I was 12 or 13, there were a lot of cracks in that for me. I saw that my mom was struggling financially to be able to be a part of this community. I saw the pressure that was put on her. I felt at school this sense of being, not ideal. There was the ideal that was held up of Maharishi and who he was and the qualities and virtues that he wanted us to have. And, I felt like I always fell short. I mean, as a funny side note, I think one of the weird, soft spots that I have just in the 2 weeks since the book has come out is the criticism from people within the TM movement that it was just like my bad attitude that made TM not work for me, and that it really harkens back to that feeling that I had when I was 12 and 13, where it was like any kind of criticism or negativity or thinking counter to what was being said was seen as bad, like a bad personality almost. And it really it hits me deeply, because I think that was a piece of what I grew up with at school. And I have gotten notes from kids, other kids from the Maharishi school who felt that sense of just not measuring up and then seeing their parents struggle. And, slowly that can lead to a real focus on hypocrisy and a kind of nihilism. And that's why I sort of do understand and feel empathetic to people who are angry at the TM movement, because I know that's a really bad feeling, and I understand that anger and outrage. I guess I'm just saying, for me, that I moved past that doubt and past the I felt like hypocrisy was not the end game. It was a position and a point of view, and it's a valid one, but there's space beyond that, and it's you can kind of delight in some of the contradictions of it, like that it's, for me, there's so much that I find totally absurd and bizarre about the TM movement, and I could I could talk about that for a while, although I won't. But it's like, don't trick me into doing it, because it would be so easy. But at the same time, I feel like meditation is such a big, important part of my life, and it completely has changed, me, and it changed my mother's life, and I hope it's something that I can, give to my daughter. So that contradiction is something I kind of enjoy and want to. I feel like there's more truth there than in the hypocrisy. I think I've forgotten your question, though.
No, that was it. It was right there, and it's all about questions of of belief and faith and questioning those beliefs and faith and how healthy that is and how common that is. But Phil, take it from there.
Claire, have obviously did not throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Right.
And in my experience, people who get disillusioned by spiritual organizations often have that kind of extreme reaction that this is all nonsense and I'm let down and it's not what it was cracked up to be, so I'm dumping the whole thing. Right. You were able to discern the difference between the human foibles of organizational life and communities and the methodologies or the practices that were taught. Have you found in looking at your contemporaries who shared your experience that there's both kinds of people?
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's a way in which I can start to feel sort of angry and righteous when I think about some of the kids I grew up with, some who I'm very close to, who, are kind of really hurt by what happened. And when you believe so truly in something and feel so connected to it, and then experience that betrayal, see that it's not entirely true, see that it's not as it was represented to be, that can really pervade your whole life. So I do see kids that I grew up with that are very nihilistic, who sort of move towards drugs and alcohol, and anger, a lot of anger. And I wouldn't say that's the majority. I would actually say the majority is somewhere closer to where I am.
Yeah.
But I do. I feel a sense of protectiveness of people who emerged hurt by that. And I see. I mean, part of writing the book, and I hope this doesn't descend into narcissism, so help me. But I mean, it is a memoir. But I feel like one of the things for me writing the book is some of those qualities that I was talking about that I didn't like about myself as a kid. In writing it and sort of having to sort of see myself as a character moving through the experience, I was able to kind of see how those helped me survive and be able to move on and not be hurt by the experience. So I've tried to kind of embrace those things. I mean, as an example, and I'm going to toss this one out because I think it might be interesting to you guys. I think, I actually had a whole chapter that kind of got deleted from the book about this, but ambition in the TM movement, I've found to be a very interesting and strange thing. And especially as kids, we were certainly told that we were going to be leaders, in the dawn of the Age of Enlightenment, and we talked about leadership all the time. But I felt like, by the time I was in high school and college, if people were calling me ambitious that I grew up with, it was sort of an insult, like that, and even, people in Fairfield would say, oh God, she's so ambitious. It was sort of like, it was just there was a certain, idea that wasn't the way that you're supposed to be. And yet, and I felt like that kind of came in some ways from the complicated relationship of Maharishi to his own ambition, because he obviously was extremely ambitious, but I don't think you could ever say that in the movement, that he was an extraordinarily ambitious person. I mean, remarkably, exceptionally ambitious. And yeah, I think that comes from the idea of being self-centered versus, group having some sort of larger transcendent experience of reality.
Claire, when you wrote the book, did you reach out to the TM movement to in your research, and what type of cooperation did or did you not get?
It's a great question. About 4 years ago, I'm sure I'm wrong on my math there, maybe 3 years ago, I wrote an article for the New York Times Magazine, and so I definitely was more engaged during that process, and that was before I had knew that I was writing a book and had sold the book. I was still sort of an idea, and I guess it was probably 4 years ago, and I did talk with John Hagelin a bit. I've tried a few times to interview Bevan, and that never happened.
We should point out that those are the two names you mentioned are leaders of the TM movement in America.
Yeah, I have, however, interacted a lot with Bobby Ross, which probably is why there may be like a more gentle feeling. For me, I felt like Bobby Ross, who is the head of the David Lynch Foundation, is sort of bringing TM into the next generation. He's shifting the focus back to just the technique and in almost this much more secular way. There's not a lot of Maharishi for people who learn TM now, and I think that is partially because of Bobby, although I don't think he'd like me to say that. And I get that. I think that's smart. I think that's probably the way that the TM movement will survive. But I interviewed Richard Bell, who is an administrator. I think he's the principal of the Maharishi School, and it was really. They were interesting. People shared their experiences really candidly, and I get. I should say, I understand that viewpoint. I think these are people. Take Mr. Bell. They are people who have dedicated their lives to an idea, and they believe very strongly in the principles that they're enacting, and so. I respect that. I don't think there's anything devious about that.
Mm-hmm. Claire, we should point out to our listeners that if they want to hear Bob Roth's side of that story, we have interviewed him, and he is in our archive.
Okay.
Well, I don't think he necessarily has a different story or never rebuttal, but it's more. Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Can you tell me in a nutshell, or is it?
Well, no. I was joking about his side. We just
he doesn't mention your book or anything like that. It's just that he would bring it as a TM movement representative. But like you said, he's bringing it to the next generation, and his emphasis is different than probably the emphasis that you saw back in the day, or Phil and I saw back in the day.
Right.
Yeah.
No, it's a good interview for people who are.
I'm going to listen to it. I have to find it. I was listening to your Marianne interview today, and she was fantastic.
Good.
That's such a
Marianne Williamson.
Claire, you have alluded to, and I found in my research, that your generation of people whose parents were the baby boomer generation of people who got involved with all the different gurus who came and essentially were the ground troops of bringing these ideas of yoga and Indian philosophy into the world, that some people grow up in communities like the one you did, and they find it and hold it as adults to be a great blessing that they had this unusual and wonderful upbringing. Others, as you suggested earlier, are very angry and bitter and feel that their lives were ruined by living in what they think of as a cult. There's a variable in this that you were both in the same community, both types of people, but you had different parents, and you had a particularly interesting set of parents, and there was a certain amount of dysfunction there. Have you found any patterns in those who made a good adaptation to adult life and those who had difficulty?
I haven't seen it so much in the parenting. I wouldn't necessarily say it was the parenting. I mean, there are cases where it's the parenting. I more see like a larger sort of psychological trait of being, a survivor, which has like a good and bad side. I mean, that's sort of what I was talking about these qualities in myself that I've not always thought were that great. But you do see how it can help you move through these experiences. And I think for me, I was probably less, even though I am sensitive, I was probably less sensitive and less hurt or slowed down by some of this stuff. I kind of just kept moving, or I had the instinct to sort of leave. I mean, as you kind of mentioned, my dad left when I was 5, and that's when my mom moved my brother and I to Fairfield. And he got sober and came back into our lives when I was 12. And he did sort of offer this counter voice to the experience that I was having in Fairfield. And I think that was a big factor for me to have somebody that I knew and I loved, sort of saying, questioning, like, why is your mom working all the time to send you to this school? And, I don't think, disagreeing with what the teachers were saying, and and sort of encouraging qualities in me that weren't being encouraged.
Right, Claire, I wanted to just say that, and again, having read the book, and I actually read it very thoroughly, your parents were both very loving parents that both really brought a lot to you. Your father was gone from your life at a certain time, and your mother was typical mother doing everything to bring highest quality of life to her kids. Your father and your mother, both well educated, your father trying to give you perspective and all. So I think anybody who might say that your questioning of your experience or your criticism of the community had anything to do with any dysfunctionality in the family doesn't know your story, because it was clear that quite frankly, it was there was a lot of functionality there and a lot of love and a lot of support, and that the way I see it, and I'd like your comment on it, is that you're a person that's drawn to philosophy, that's drawn to theology, that's drawn to the bigger questions, the deeper thinking, and then that's what led to your questioning it in the first place. And then you went to graduate school to study religion, University of Chicago, a great program. You went to Columbia Journalism School, and you started thinking, and the book really comes, as I see it, and correct me if I'm wrong, in your quest to really deeply understand what your experience was, what was the good, the bad, the ugly, every aspect of it, and bring it out and share that with people as objectively and clearly as you can. And I think it's a process for you that you're still searching and seeking and trying to give a correct perspective to it.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, besides kids who went to the Maharishi school, like people who had this sort of very similar experience to me, the other group of readers that I've really heard from and have really connected to the book are people who grew up in some kind of religion, particularly Mormonism, just to throw it out there, where there are all these amazing qualities to growing up Mormon. You have an incredible sense of community, incredible sense of purpose, a real closeness, very much like clean living, which the TM movement also has. I mean, and is stereotypes, but then, there's these like incredible numbers on, with the advent of the internet of, this attrition of people leaving Mormonism because suddenly, it's a new religion and relatively, and there's a lot of stuff online that, raises questions for young people who grew up in Mormonism, and sort of, so what I've connected with are a lot of sort of well-educated Mormons who have left their communities and really miss and long for the functionality and the good parts. And I think, that's the sort of trick of this. I mean, with my family, we were in tough circumstances, and my mom made a choice to go to this utopian environment. We were sort of totally broke in New York City, and my dad disappeared. So that was certainly the dysfunctionality. But I actually, I mean, I think as Dennis said, like, I think my mom was incredibly high functioning. Like, retrospectively, especially now that I'm a parent, I can't even understand how she did it, but she was working all the time, to be able to support us, but also to be able to support, her pursuit of higher states of consciousness and enlightenment. And I think that's, it's so rare to see somebody pursue that even when they don't have a lot of options, And so I think, the picture that you get from my family is maybe a little bit more acute than if you talk to somebody, a friend of mine that grew up in the movement who had a lot more resources, maybe had a 2-parent family, and, that would be a different story. I think for us, I really deeply felt and saw the cost of Maharishi's programs because, at a certain point, everything became, in my experience, commodified. And that was kind of brutal.
Mm-hmm. Actually, I thought your mother came across in your book as an indomitable spirit, very strong and determined to do right by her kids, and also determined to gain the highest states of consciousness, and that's not easy when you're struggling financially and all that. But the other aspect of your book that I want to praise is you have a skilled journalist's eye for the right detail and the right use of anecdote. And some of them were very telling and rather amusing, frankly. And one that stood out was the proclamation in 1989 about the Berlin Wall.
Right.
And that seemed to be a turning point for you in your young life. Maybe you could tell us about that.
Yeah, that was definitely the sort of moment for me where everything changed. Not to sound dramatic, but it really was. I mean, we had a school assembly called, and everyone rushed over to the auditorium, and Bevan was speaking, and it was, sort of an emergency assembly, if you will. And he told us, with tears in his eyes, that the Berlin Wall had been torn down, and it was because of our meditations. And it was just this like click, this pop for me of like that is false. That is not true. And I hadn't had that before. It was like almost getting, popped out of a bubble. It suddenly didn't make sense to me, and I felt, looking around me and seeing people celebrating, that they were wrong, that they were deluded.
How old were you?
I was 12.
Wow.
And it took time, but that was the beginning for me of, and that's as far as the TM movement goes, and it's a thing that you see in lots of different religious organizations, but the focus going from, the individual experience to world change, I think it's a tough one, belief-wise. People can believe and trust in their own experiences, but the idea that those experiences are having an effect on the world, it's a tougher proposition.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Claire, you've mentioned to me in conversation that some of your closest friends are still folks, young people that you grew up with, well, they were young at the time, in Fairfield, that you had a common experience. Do you think one of the reasons you've stayed so close to, and I know a lot of people your age, say late 30s or whatever, that may have no association with the TM community anymore, but they still are tight with a lot of their friends that they went to school with back then. Do you think it was because your upbringing was so unusual, and you had some, you don't have anybody else to share that experience with, other than the folks you grew up with?
Yeah, I think you see a mix. I mean, I would say generally, what my experience has been that of staying very connected and feeling like a true sense of shared experience and intimacy with those people. I mean, I think, there was probably a point in my early 20s where I didn't think I could marry somebody that didn't grow up the way that I did. Like, I felt like such a distinct outsider. That obviously changed. I didn't marry somebody who grew up there. Quite the opposite. But, on the other hand, I have gotten these letters in the last couple of weeks, which have made me aware that there are a lot of people who moved away when they were 18 and never looked back, and they never talk about it. They have completely sealed off that part of their life, and it's almost like a secret for them. And there are a fair number of people who do that, and I even have that with some friends. I guess it's not exactly the same thing as what you're saying, but it is interesting that some people really have shut that out. And I do have friends who've done that who never talk about the way they grew up.
Right. I think it's not unlike somebody that grows up like in an Orthodox, like a Hasidic community, and they choose at some point to leave. Some people stay very connected to that community that they grew up with. Others just, that's it, I'm gone, I'm moving on, sort of a thing. So I think it's...
Yeah, and I definitely would say and argue that the TM movement in the 80s and 90s was full orthodoxy. I would say that. I would say that was basically a sort of form of fundamentalism that was happening.
Well, I would, from my experience, just modify that to say where you were and that aspect of it. But the millions of people out there just meditating twice a day would not have had that same experience.
No, that's why I definitely like Fairfield 80s and 90s.
Yeah.
Moment in time.
What was, in the course of actually researching, thinking so much, and writing the book and looking back on your life, how did the experience itself of working on the book, change your view of your experience and the world you grew up in at all? How do you see things differently after having written it from before?
I think I feel really lucky that I got to write it, because it did allow me to really move through these questions. But I don't think I'm at a final answer. And I think I'm figuring it out. I mean, I feel I don't know how do I live in Los Angeles and have a sense of purpose and community like we had in Fairfield? I don't know the answer to that. I don't think you can. And I think it felt incredible, but I also think it's definitely, it's a razor's edge. I also think that community and that sense of purpose can lead to some pretty funky group dynamics.
Claire, I have one final question for you. What experiences and what lessons did you draw from your childhood, from your upbringing, both in Fairfield and both after you left Fairfield and went to Los Angeles with your father, that you used to create the success? And obviously, you've had a lot of success as a journalist to be as successful as you've been in your career.
Oh, well, thank you for calling me successful. I appreciate that. I will hold that close today. Doesn't always feel like that, but I appreciate it. I think the thing that I got, if I was going to say there was one thing from the way that I grew up, I think I have a sense of self that is, not attached to my thoughts, that is not, that I do have like a sacred sort of quietness that I identify as self, and that it is transcendent, and that I feel connected. And I see for a lot of people and friends and that I have now that there is that real identification with their thoughts. That's real sort of separating point.
Right, it's a great point.
And I think I feel very appreciative of that. You know, as stressed out as I can get, and I completely get stressed out, and I can be anxious. This has been an anxious couple of weeks for me.
Mm-hmm.
I do think that there's some interiority there that I feel like is kind of a gift.
Yeah, very good. One last question for you. Speaking of anecdotes from your book, did you ever get to write about Marilyn Monroe?
No.
Oh, no, well, there you go.
You know what I did?
You and Norman Mailer.
Yeah, I know. I love her. I still love her. I actually just...
This comes out in the book, by the way, for people listening in that haven't read the book. Yeah.
Right.
I was very attracted around like 13, 14, 15 to this like sort of 1950s sensibility of the world. Like it felt like the opposite of, you know, Utopia Park and the Tia movement, like glamour and all that. But I just ordered a set of stationery that is identical to hers. So that is as close as I'm going to come, which I can't even tell you the amount of joy I got in ordering that. It was sort of creepy.
Well, Claire, thank you so much for your time. Again, the book, Greetings from Utopia Park, Surviving a Transcendent Childhood. I highly recommend the book. And one thing everybody has shared in common that's read this book that I've talked to, and it's been a few dozen people now, everybody said they read it very quickly. They couldn't put it down. So that says a lot. And Claire, I want to wish you continued success and hope you back on the shows at some point in the future.
Thank you, Dennis. Thank you, Phil. I appreciate it.
Thanks for coming, and thanks for writing an honest and enjoyable book.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Take care.